My name is Tajareshan. I'm the director of the UCL-Energy Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's joint event, which is hosted by the UCL-Energy Institute and the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources as part of its public lecture series. I understand we have a hashtag, BP Lecture UCL, that people can use to tweet about the event. All details will be on the holding slide in the room, which is what they are. The format of this evening, Christoph has very kindly agreed to talk for about 45 minutes to an hour. That'll be followed by Paul Eakins, who is the director of the Institute for Sustainable Resources. He will act as a respondent and will talk for about 10 minutes. And then there will be an opportunity for a question and answer session for 15 minutes. After that, all attendees are invited to a drinks reception, which will be held on the balcony just outside the lecture theatre. The fire exits should be labelled. There's 2 fire exits at the top and sides. So if you could follow those, we're not planning to have a fire rehearsal today. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Christoph has a distinguished track record in both academia and economic policy making. To have somebody who has both of those skills is great. Prior to joining BP, he was at the World Bank, where he served as the bank's chief economist in Russia and in Brazil. Before that, he worked in the office of the chief economist at EBRD in London. And prior to that, he's held various academic posts, first in Germany, and then as professor of economics at the University of California in Los Angeles, and he held several visiting appointments. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Christoph Rühl to the platform.
Thank you very much. As they say in my country, don't praise the day before the evening. Thank you all for coming here, and thank you for the invitation. What I'm going to present to you is something which we have done now for a number of years, a long-term energy outlook. This is the 4th time we publish it on an annual basis. It has been around a little bit longer, but it used to be an internal document for BP for strategic purposes and so on, and then it was decided to make it public, mostly to help feed into a debate which we think could be advanced and could be enhanced, and is very important because when you think of it, energy, of course, obviously, goes directly or indirectly into any kind of economic activity. But sometimes when you open the newspaper, it seems like everybody is allowed to say anything about it. We have done it 3 times before, always until the year 2030. This is the first time that we published it 5 more years until 2035. We took the occasion to give a big shake-up to the crystal ball, and I'm happy to report that in terms of very long-term trends, not that much changed, but the additional 5 years do provide some additional insights, and I will point them out as we go along. Now, before we go right into it, I want to point out one thing which is probably clear to all of you, but it's very, very close to my heart, and I want to be very clear about it. This is a point forecast, warts and all. And of course, the only thing we really know with certainty about these kind of forecasts, baseline 2012 going out all the way to 2035, is that it will be wrong, wholly or in parts. So question, why do we take this risk? Why do we do this kind of point forecast? Answer, we do it because we think that nothing forces and focuses the mind of an analyst as much as if he is forced to walk from today into an uncertain future. And mostly in the following sense, that along this journey, he or she will encounter numerous forks in the roads, big areas of uncertainty, where oftentimes, genuinely, we don't know is the system going this way or that way. But if we're very lucky, and that's the only value you can expect from such a forecast, we'll be able to identify some of these forks in the road, some of these fault lines of this relatively complicated system, as I like to call it, and also probably some of the determinants which will tell us it goes this way or that way. That's the real value added of this kind of exercise. And that's why we do not do scenarios. Scenarios would be the alternative, where you try to plaster the horizon with all sorts of outcomes and then walk backwards. It's not as rigorous, we think, as a forecast. It doesn't force your mind on these decision points as much. And that's also the reason, I would argue, why scenarios you find more often in institutions and places where writing is by consensus, where you need a political compromise, etc. And you don't see the IMF doing a scenario, for example. You see them doing forecasts for this reason of being rigorous about things. What I would like to do is to start by giving you sort of the very, very big picture where we stand in global energy markets. You'll see there's always an emphasis on also saying where we come from before we discuss where we go to. And then discuss a little bit fuel by fuel with an emphasis on two things which are important, at least from today's perspective. One is the so-called shale revolution. We should always be careful with the R word, but that's how it's called now, happening in the US and probably elsewhere, and the question, how does that change the market of fossil fuels, mostly oil and gas as we know it? And the other is the issue of CO2 emissions, climate change, which is something which is not as high, it seems, today on the public agenda, but I think it is something which may come back, and therefore I'm going to have a closer look at that as well. And with this, let's just go right into it. Let's look at the big picture very briefly, and then I give you some simple frame of reference for the rest of the discussion, that it doesn't get all drowned out in numbers. We, like most other people, would expect to live in a world which continues to grow in several dimensions over this forecast. Again, forecasting period 2012 to 2035, so from now on another 23 years. Over that period, population is forecast to grow another 1.7 billion. And these UN population forecasts are actually some of the more accurate forecasts we have. Most economists would expect the global economy to about double over this time. And this, of course, has to translate into an increase in energy consumption. To give you one ballpark reference number, we think that global energy consumption over this period until 2035 will increase by about 1.5% per annum. That would then be an increase of 41% over the forecasting period. Now, 41% over the next 20 odd years, that sounds pretty massive, and it is pretty massive, but it is considerably less than what we have seen, say, over the last 20 years. In fact, what seems to be happening is that the world comes out, when you look at the increments of the right-hand side, of a growth hump. Energy consumption keeps growing, but it accelerated markedly round about the year 2000 and is coming down now in a process which should be finished, we think, round about the year 2020. And when you ask yourself what drives that acceleration, this hump, and then deceleration of energy consumption growth, the answer, of course, is the obvious one. It was this very massive period of industrialization which we have witnessed. By country, you see the biggest animal in the shop is China, of course, but it's not only China. It's all the small developing or industrializing, whatever, emerging markets, whatever you want to call them, in between as well. For the purposes of this exercise, we divided the world in OECD and non-OECD economies, the so-called developed and the so-called developing countries, or the industrializing and emerging markets versus the mature, old industrial economies. And nearly all the growth in our picture is driven by the non-OECD economies, and you see the huge role which China plays in this process on the right-hand side. But once again, China is just the most obvious example of many others. It's interesting to look at the OECD separately. We think that in the OECD, growth over the next 20 odd years will be only about 5%. And here's the first of little morsel or nugget from extending the forecasting period. In our book, at least, OECD energy consumption will start to fall at around 2030. And if I take a subgroup of the OECD, namely the countries which are today members of the European Union, we don't think that energy consumption in those countries will ever go back to the level it had in 2006, which was the highest ever. It seems to be steadily declining, raising an intriguing question, which I want to save for the discussion, namely whether it's possible that you have sustained economic growth with constant or falling energy consumption. There's nothing in the book which rules it out. We don't know, but that's one of the questions which comes out of this exercise. If we look at the same picture, but this time asking ourselves, okay, all this energy consumed by these various places on the Earth, where does it go? By usage or by sector? The first observation is something which still surprises people, sometimes myself included, which is that by far the biggest share of global energy is actually used to be converted into another type of energy, i.e. it's used to produce electricity. More than half of it goes into the production of electricity. And if you then allocate electricity also among the main sectors of the economy, it remains industrial demand for energy, which is the strongest growing. Followed by a sector called other, which has things like agriculture, services, household heating, all the rest of it, with transport, probably the most prominent in newspaper discussions, a distant third. And if you look now again on the right-hand side on this hump of demand growth accelerating and slowing down again, which I pointed out, then those of you blessed with a photographic memory will immediately realize that the increments and then the deceleration in industrial energy demand are slightly bigger than what we had for China, indicating that as energy consumption in China slows down because the economy adjusts to a model more based on services and domestic consumption, less on very energy intensive infrastructure projects and industrial mass production for exports, that as that happens in China, the slack in industrial energy demand to some extent will be taken up by other countries who are still going through this first wave of initial industrialization, which is the most energy intensive part. And I come back to that as well. Big countries among them, as we will see, like India or Indonesia, for example. The third lens through which you can look at this big picture, this snapshot of today, would be to ask, okay, so far we've always mentioned energy. It's obviously primary energy, all the fuels combined. But if I distinguish fuel by fuel, how does it look like? The first observation we have, so these are all the components of primary energy here: fossil fuels, oil, coal, gas, and then the non-fossil fuels, renewables, hydroelectricity, which we separate from renewables, and nuclear power. The first statement which follows from this picture is that in our book at least, this will still be a world based on fossil fuels by 2035. To be precise, 81%, and don't shoot the messenger, this is what comes out of it, 81% of energy consumption 2035 still consists of coal, gas, and oil. Of those three, we have seen the last 20 years, natural gas being the fastest growing and oil being the slowest growing, and this is a trend we think will continue. Just for reference, we have oil consumption growth at about 0.8% per annum compared to natural gas of about 1.9% per annum. Coal in the middle with this hump, which you again see on the right-hand side, because coal is, of course, the fuel of choice in those industrializing countries. So you could, from these pictures, say, okay, this hump is driven by coal in industry in China, but that would be a shortcut, as I said, because it's not only China, but it's certainly true that wherever you have industrialization among emerging market economies, it is driven by coal for reasons which we all discuss in a second. Now, before I go and outline some of these trends behind the numbers, let me do something else, because I always find it helpful if one has sort of a mental framework before going into too much detail. When you have these discussions about long-term energy developments, long-term trends, forward or backward, there's always 1 billion and 2 questions. But usually you can group them into 3 big themes. And these themes will be with us for the duration of that lecture. People ask questions. The first group of questions, the first bucket in which you can put this discussion, has to do with resource availability. There's very often the question, okay, you tell us, the world is growing, but are there enough resources to fuel the world in the way you describe it? That is an important question, and I'll come back to that in a second. The second big bucket under which you can assemble questions on long-term energy development usually has to do with security, with energy security. Yeah, you tell us there is enough fuels, but will they be made available to where they are needed? What about supply disruptions? What about trade reorientation? All these kind of things. What about energy security? And the third question, generally speaking, the third bucket in which you can group this discussion is the question of sustainability. yeah, maybe you tell us there's enough fuels and they will be all going to where they are needed, but how sustainable is that system really? And today, of course, the question of sustainability is more or less tied in with the question of climate change and carbon emissions. Roughly speaking, to put the cards on the table at the beginning, we do think that there is no resource problem as such. For the next 20 years, for a multiplicity of reasons, we do think, and I personally believe too, there is enough resources to fuel that world which we are describing, for better or worse. There is, it's more ambivalent, but there is always, of course, issues with energy security. We will see some big reorientations of trade. We will discuss supply disruptions in the Arab Spring, these kind of things, which we think will be manageable, are manageable, but require constant care and attention, will be with us forever. It's the kind of stuff which gives people like me a job. And then on the third bucket, the third big theme in this public discussion on sustainability, if you believe what climate scientists say, then there is no reason to sleep quiet at night. Then, in that strict definition, this is not a sustainable system. And I come back to that as we go along. But I think it's useful if you sort of park these three big themes in the back of your head as we go through the presentation. And let me start by addressing the first one head on. I described a world to you which is reliant on a big leap, not as big as in the past, but still a big leap, we said, of 41% more fuels over the next 20 odd years. Where is it all coming from? First of all, it is coming from increased production in every region of the world except Europe. And let me give you just some examples for how this really looks like. When we look, for example, at oil reserves or natural gas reserves or coal reserves, proved reserves, these are fuels which can be produced with today's technology and today's prices economically, then we see them going up all the time, despite increased consumption. We have now twice the oil reserves we had in 1980, proved reserves, again the most narrow definition you can find, despite the fact that between 1980 and today, more has been consumed than we had reserves in 1980. So reserves continue to grow. When you look at the regional breakdown where this stuff comes from, perhaps surprising, the biggest producing region is Asia. Why Asia? Because Asia is not only a huge coal consumer, it's also a huge coal producer. So there is the issue of sort of more of the same, mostly when we talk about fossil fuels. But you can look at the same question, where is the stuff coming from, also through a different lens. And that is the issue, the question of new technologies, of innovation, which gives us, in quotation marks, new fuels. If I loosely group together all the fuels which can be called new, simply on the grounds that they haven't been around 10, 12 years ago, then I would have to add what people call unconventional liquids, so that would be oil sands, that would be shale oil, and that would be biofuels, and add to that shale gas, and add to that renewables, all these things, and call them new just on the basis that they haven't been around much a decade or so ago, then these new fuels in our picture account for more than 40% of the increment which we see over the next 23 years. They alone will, by 2035, we think, account for about 17% of the global production of energy. And that's the second big reason, this constant ability of the system to reinvent itself. In particular, one has to say, of the fossil fuel system, where you have competition instead of subsidies, to reinvent themselves, to create what may be called new fuels, which leaves little doubt for us that the resource constraint is not under the ground or in what nature provides. Now with that, let me switch and instead of more numbers, just outline some of the big trends which have been with us for a while and which we think will also be influential in determining what happens in the future. The first one is a very important one, and also, by the way, a third reason for optimism on the resource front, is the development of energy efficiency. What you have here on the left-hand side is a scissor, which opens actually quite nicely, denoting economic growth and energy consumption growth. What it tells you is that over time, we have made big progress in being able to produce more and more economic output with, relatively speaking, less and less energy. What it really denotes is a number called energy intensity. And energy intensity is probably the broadest possible measure of efficiency we have. It's defined as the amount of energy you need for 1 unit of economic output, 1 pound of GDP. And that energy intensity over the last 20 years has improved massively, way more than 20%. And we do think it will continue to improve over the forecasting period by another more than 30%. These efficiency improvements are driven by a variety of things, and I'll discuss them later in some more detail. But they are, of course, instrumental also in making sure that the demand for resources doesn't go quite up as fast as economic growth, and that the system, from the point of view of resource availability, is more sustainable than it looks to many observers. A second big trend is the development of fuel shares on the right-hand side here. So now we are not talking anymore about volume growth or production growth or consumption growth, but about market shares. And when you look at this, an interesting picture emerges. You have on top of it oil, and what you see there is the only fuel which has a clear structural break. The consumption of oil, the market share of oil, went up since the Second World War, in the 1950s and the 60s, very, very steeply, as oil was available cheap enough to compete with gas and with coal in all applications, not only transport, but also industrial use and electricity production. And since the 1970s, since the 2 oil price shocks which we had there, when oil became, relatively speaking, more expensive than other fossil fuels, you see the market share of oil decline. The mirror image is provided by natural gas. Natural gas, I told you already, the fastest growing fossil fuel, grows all the time on the back, A, of more availability. They find more of it all the time. But B, also important, on the back of better transportability. This reflects the development of liquefied natural gas, the gas which you freeze and then you put it on tankers and you ship it somewhere else and regasify it, which allows natural gas for the first time to become independent from pipelines and to be shipped literally across continents where it now competes with coal. And so that makes natural gas the fastest growing fuel. And then you have coal in the middle with this very characteristic hump. It started to decline everywhere. And then with the boost of industrialization in non-OECD economies, including but not only in China, it has this increase. We do think that the market share of coal is set to decline again. This is not based on countries like China sort of stopping to grow or faltering. It is based on this grand experiment which the Chinese are undertaking, namely what they call to rebalance their economy, really to restructure it from very energy intensive, as I said, infrastructure and export-oriented industrial mass production towards more domestic consumption and services, on this experiment working well. It's a pretty safe bet on coal, because if it doesn't work well, it will grow slower and coal demand will also go down. Now, when you look at the non-fossil fuels, this is a picture sort of which has also interesting parts. I want to point out to you a parallel which poses a real interesting question, and that is between what happened to nuclear energy in the 1970s and 80s, when it grew very rapidly and gained market share in the global system, and the parallel which exists between what we have seen for renewables already and what we expect for renewables in the future, namely a market penetration which proceeds just as fast as what we had with the 70s and the 80s in nuclear. Now, nuclear energy is always, when you look at the face of it, what happened here was in the late 70s, early 80s, it stopped gaining market share on the back of security safety concerns and huge political protest. What is very often forgotten in today's discussion is that it is also an extremely expensive form of energy. It always was highly subsidized, still is everywhere where it's used. I'll give you one example, just with the eyes of an economist. There is not a single country in the world where you can find private insurance against the cost of a nuclear accident. It will always be socialized everywhere. If that's not a huge subsidy, then I don't know what is. And that high cost of nuclear also had something to do with it hitting a glass ceiling at about 7%, 8% market share in the 1980s, from which it never managed to break. Why does that matter? Because when I look at the growth assumptions about renewables in the past and now also in the future, it's almost as if the system the numbers wanted to tell us something, namely, here is how big you can push a technology, a new energy technology, into the global system if you really, really want, with full support of the government. But then the question arises, renewables are also still, by and large, a subsidized sector. And so the question arises, will they also hit a glass ceiling? Because when you have a subsidized fuel and it increases its market share faster than its unit costs decline, the amount of subsidization has to go up and up and up with every gain it makes. And what you're seeing right now in Europe, in Spain, in the UK, also now in Germany, is that the subsidies for renewables are being cut left, right, and center. And not because people don't like them, of course they do. They're being cut because they become too expensive. And so the big question here is there reason to suppose that renewables will not falter in the way nuclear did because they become too expensive to be financed above a certain threshold? To give you the answer right away, we do think that this will be the case. We do think renewable learning curves are coming down faster, costs are improving faster. They are not facing probably the same sort of fate nuclear had, but it's not a given. It's not something which is entirely clear. It is one of these forks in the road. And let me also be clear in terms of numbers. I showed you this picture here about, on the left-hand side, about the world still being fossil fuel-based. This is not produced by some malicious intent. That is based on a world in which renewables continue to grow in our forecast by 6.5% over the next 20 years, which is extremely ambitious and extremely high over such a long period of time. But they start from a starting point where renewables in the base year 2012 globally had a market share of 2.4%. 2.4%. And that's all renewables for electricity and for biofuels for transport. 2.4% of which 0.5% biofuels. And even if you assume very high growth rates as we do of 6.5%, it will only go to 7% by 2035. It's just a base effect. That's the rationale behind this relatively small market share of renewables. In fact, what we assume is that renewables will not be hit by the glass ceiling because their costs come down. I said already, basically, for one extent, based on learning curves and what we observe in the industry. And another reason for it is that they are much more exposed, potentially at least, to competition. When nuclear energy globally first accounted for 2% of electricity production, it was present in only 14 countries. When wind power, exactly 40 years later, first accounted for 2% of global power production, it was present in almost 100 countries. And it's these kind of considerations which we think will sort of win the day and make them continue to grow. But I want to just point out at this instant that this low role for renewables in the future is what we have in the numbers today, and it's very hard to see how that should change if we don't assume some surprising discretionary technical change of the unpredictable kind, which we don't. Now, this picture of fuel shares is interesting also in itself for an entirely different reason. If we have this halfway right, give or take a few percentage points, this would be the very first time in human history that we would live in a world without a dominant fuel. Think about it. First it was wood, then it was coal, then it was the age of oil, and now it seems as if these fuel shares of major fuels are converging. There's nothing automatic about this process. It will continue afterwards. It looks different in the OECD than non-OECD, but globally, this is the world in which we live right now. First time, no dominant fuel, even though it's driven by very different things. Oil, increasingly as it becomes expensive, specialized only in transport, competed away from power generation and industry by cheaper fuels, and coal and gas increasingly globally in competition with each other especially in the generation of power. A third trend I wanted to point out, which surprised me, for example, was I told you that electricity generation is the biggest area in which all these primary energies are going, is that this is not stopping. When you go back 100 years, you might be tempted to think that growth in electricity consumption is something associated with industrialization, and as you have more mature economies, higher degree of services and all that, it goes down. It's not. Continuously, the share of primary energy which goes into the generation of electricity continues to increase, whether this is in the OECD or in the non-OECD. Now, why should we bother about this intermediate step? Precisely, of course, when you think of fuel gas, because it is the biggest application of all of them. And the right-hand side gives you a first taste of how this has developed over time, another theme one needs to look at if one wants to discuss things like climate change. Always a relatively constant share of hydropower, of course, and then a world which comes from a heavy, heavy domination of coal in power generation. And the same picture as before. When oil becomes globally available, with its easy ways of transporting, with its high energy density, it immediately crowds out coal everywhere in power generation as well. And then after the 1970s, after oil becomes cheaper, it is replaced first by nuclear, then if nuclear couldn't be sustained, increasingly by natural gas, and now in recent years, more and more by renewables. I told you renewables in the global system, less than 2.5%, but in power generation, already 5%. We think it will go up to about 15% by 2035. In the European Union, by the way, it's already 15% today and set to go up to about 35%. And then two more big trends, which bring me back to my three buckets. First of all, we live in a phase right now which sees huge reorientations in energy trade, and this is of course driven by shale oil and shale gas in North America. Traditionally, when you look at the world in terms of big regions and continents, we always had three importing regions: North America, Asia, and Europe. This is shifting. North America, that's the US plus Mexico plus Canada, will become energy independent, self-sufficient, one should say actually, and starting to move from an energy deficit on the left-hand side here to an energy surplus to an energy exporter. They already export coal. The US will start to export natural gas this decade, and North America as a continent will also start to export oil. That means that the importing regions of the world are reduced to two, much more import concentration, of which Europe is forecast to be relatively stagnant, and Asia fast growing. And this, at the same time, among the exporting regions, you probably have more competition over time. This is a source for potential instability to which I will come back to, but it relates to this big topic of energy security, how to manage this reorientation in trade. Just think about what it means for unstable regions like the Middle East. And you get some idea of the dimension of the problem, which comes under the heading of energy security and deserves some discussion. And then finally, and again I will come back to that in more detail, we have another scissor here, this time the one between energy consumption and CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels, from energy use. And you can already see that that scissor isn't behaving as well as the energy efficiency scissor at all. So what you can call carbon intensity, the amount of carbon burned by using some given amount of energy, improves, but very, very gradually. Over the last 20 years, it has improved by about 0.5% because of the very high share of coal in our primary energy mix. What this really denotes carbon intensity is sort of the carbon intensity, the carbon load of the fuel mix which we are using, with of course coal more carbon intensive than natural gas, and natural gas more so than renewables. That's already sort of the very, very big picture. A picture where the world continues to grow, including continued rapid energy consumption growth, but very unevenly distributed, driven by the industrializing part of the world, by their economic use, not only because they grow faster, because industrialization is energy intensive, especially in its early stages. A world continuing to be based on fossil fuels because of the very low starting point for global renewables. A world where we think there is no reason to suppose, because of conventional fuel availability, because of innovation, and because of these rapid improvements in energy intensity, to believe that there is a real resource constraint limiting the system. One in which we see huge reorientations in global energy trade with all sorts of affiliated problems, and one which, from the perspective of climate scientists, is nowhere near, and I'll show you this later in detail, targets such as 450 ppm for 2 degrees Celsius increase, or 1990 levels, or whatever one wants to take, where there's very, very limited progress in avoiding the translation of energy consumption into CO2 emissions. Now with this, let me concentrate on oil and gas, and I will skip over some things to make it not too long, stick to my 60 minutes. And let's start with what is perhaps still the biggest and the most central of all the energy markets, the market for oil. Or I should correct myself and call it, like here, the market for global liquids, because it also includes all liquids, including biofuels, for example. This is an attempt, again, to start with the big picture and to denote how, for this forecasting period, the next 20 odd years, demand, supply develop in a very big summary. First of all, the number. What everybody always wants to know, what do you think is liquids consumption going to be in 2035? We think it will be about 109 million barrels per day. You don't need to keep all these numbers, but that is an increase of about 19 million barrels per day over what it was in 2012, our base year. So keep in mind, it's an increase of about 20%. Less than energy overall, because oil is growing the slowest, but substantial. All of this increase and more of it will come from the so-called developing world, based simply on their needs for more motorization and more transport. We have, in fact, declining oil consumption in the OECD countries since 2005, and we think that this is a lasting phenomenon. This is a structural decline which will not recover. The logic is fairly simple. In our picture, oil increasingly is only used in transport, where it still has no effective competition. And what you have in the OECD countries is very stable populations and a very high saturation with cars. We also have assumptions from the car industry about big efficiency increases in cars in the future, just as much as in the past. And what this means is that in the OECD, efficiency improvements in transport are outpacing the number of new cars, and that's why our consumption falls. In the non-OECD countries, the other picture. So many, it's not that they only buy less efficient cars. They have the same efficiency improvements perhaps, but the number of cars grows so fast that the increase in the numbers outperforms the efficiency gains. That was what drives the biggest driver of oil consumption growth. And you see here Asia, by far the lion's share, but also the Middle East, basically also on part of these tremendous subsidies they have, accounting for more and more oil consumption. In fact, we think that oil consumption per capita, again in the last 5 years, an additional nugget here, in our forecast in the Middle East will outperform the US, which currently is the highest, based on this very cheap oil available there. And then on the supply side, two major sources of supply: OPEC, the cartel of oil-producing countries, and then what is called here non-OPEC growth, mostly from North America. These are these non-conventional liquids, biofuels, oil sands, and especially shale oil, and I'll come back to that in a second. There is a timing problem, which I want to outline right at the beginning. We do think that the growth from North America and other places of unconventional liquids will come first. This will dominate this decade and perhaps most of the next decade, and the OPEC increase will come in only towards the end of the period, comprised of more of the same crude oil and NGLs. NGLs is natural gas liquids, something which is a byproduct of the production of natural gas and has no quotas. So OPEC members like it and can produce it because there's no limitation. Let me jump over the demand side, other than to say very briefly that it is, as I said already, non-OECD transport which grows the fastest and is the biggest part here. And you see it yourself, the decline in OECD demand for oil. And how we estimate our transport fuel demand and all of that, let me postpone that if you're interested in transport fuels for the discussion later. And let me just jump straight into what is of most interest to most people these days. Excuse me. And this is the question: what is really happening there with tight oil or shale oil as it's called now. On the left-hand side, you have again the big picture. Again, this is our increase by almost 20% to about 109 million barrels per day, and the question, where does it come from? The dark green area at the bottom, this is conventional oil production, as in Alaska or in the North Sea or maybe offshore Brazil. It's moderating, declining maybe a little bit, basically stable. On top you have OPEC. OPEC crude production, and then this natural gas liquids which come out of these countries. And what I want to talk about is this little fan, this little sliver in the middle. This is what people call unconventional fuels put in the bigger context. It is, again, a little bit of biofuels, oil sands, almost exclusively from Canada, and then tight oil. Tight oil is sort of our expression for what people call shale oil. On the right-hand side is a production profile which we try to construct only for tight oil, so only for shale oil. We did this the first time more than a year ago, where we just took together all the knowledge we could get on the geology, on infrastructure requirement, also political assumptions about how accessible it will be, and so, in order to come up with an estimate in an area where, of course, uncertainty is still huge. We were surprised when we first did it. We were actually the first ones, and I know that it's true by now, who came up with this statement that North America will be oil self-sufficient in a few years' time because of this development. But we were surprised when we found out, we compared it with other people's, that we were at the very conservative end of the forecasting spectrum. So what are we saying here? We're saying that we expect shale oil or tight oil to come from literally nothing a few years ago to about 7% of global oil consumption by 2035, about 8 million barrels. Very, very rapid increase. More important than the numbers, let me point out three characteristics here. Number one, we are right now in a phase of very, very rapidly accelerating growth. This is not going to continue. We do think that growth will continue, but at slower and slower rates. It will mellow a little bit and decelerate a little bit. Number two, this development of decelerating growth, but basically anything which happens over the foreseeable future, will still be driven by what happens in North America, the US, Canada, and Mexico, including this deceleration in growth. In fact, we think US production will start to decline in the 2020s. And number three, yes, there are all sorts of other countries moving into that space, trying to utilize the same technologies, but not quite fast enough to reverse this picture of decelerating growth. The biggest of the new countries likely to produce shale oil in the future will be Russia, but there's also places in Latin America, for example, Argentina or Colombia, which are good candidates for that. And then what we did was take this production profile, for better or worse, the only one we have, and see what would be some of the repercussions in global oil markets if it turned out to be true. Now, let me make, before I go there, actually, let me steal 3 minutes and make a little footnote, because that could be good for the discussion. A big question to ask is this shale stuff somehow different from conventional resources? Most people would argue it is, because it's so widespread available and so on. I would argue it is as well. And the next question along these lines would be to ask, so why is it that of all the countries in the world, all this non-conventional growth seems to come from Canada and the US? Right? This countries nobody had on the map 10 years ago. And the intuitive answer to this probably would be, well, must be because that's where the resources are. Huh? We all know oil sands in Canada and lots of shale rock in the US. And as a footnote, one point to keep in mind for you, I think, which is truly important, is that this answer almost certainly would be wrong. We know that there's more heavy oil in Venezuela than there is in Canada. And nothing has come out of Venezuela as a consequence of 10 years of high and rising prices. We know, our geologists tell us, that China probably has more shale gas resources than the US. Nothing came out of China over these 10 years of high and rising prices. You can push the envelope. You could ask questions such as deep water production. Huh? A lot of it coming offshore the US, nothing coming offshore Mexico, even though everybody knows oil doesn't respect political borders. The reason it comes from these two countries has to do with competition. It is because these are countries which have 30, 40, 50 years of competitive energy markets. Everybody can invest there, And everybody did. Take the so-called shale gas revolution. 1990s, very high gas prices, and known resources. Everybody knew about shale gas. It was just not economic to produce. And then what happened? A whole flock of mostly medium and small enterprises moved in that space, trying to connect the two, the high prices and the known resources. Many of them losing their shirt in the process. And only after a few have succeeded and developed these technologies did the Exxons and BPs, the big guys in this business, move in as well. It's very important because what it tells you is that energy markets in the long run are no different from any other market. I always say if you triple the price for jackets, you'll see in 3 months' time more jackets being produced. For cars, it may take 3 years. In energy, it may take 10 years because of the big complexity and size of these projects. But ultimately, it is competition breeding this kind of innovation which we have seen. And people give you these laundry lists from US having the best infrastructure, the biggest rig fleet, tradability of property rights is all true. But take 1 or 2 of them and implant them somewhere else and it won't work. Because these things themselves are just like a mirror image of having these competitive energy markets. End footnote. So when you have this kind of phenomenon, and it's already big, but should also make no mistake, the US, for the second year in a row, had the biggest increase in their oil production in their history. And these guys produced last year, and they produced oil since 1859. Right? And it can go on. It is already a massive increase. When this happens, and you're sitting in my shoes, most likely the boss will knock on your door and will ask you, so Christoph, what does that mean for oil markets? And of course, what he really wants to know is what does it mean for oil prices? And here we come at one of these classical forks in the road. Because if the oil market were to be a normal market, this stuff is already big enough that the only remaining question for an economist would have been to say, okay, prices will go down, and I can tell you how fast and how and to which point. But the oil market is not a normal market. The oil market is run, among other things, has a big producer cartel in it called OPEC, controlling a sizable pound of global production. And so in the matter of oil markets, this question, what does it do to prices, will seamlessly translate into the question, will OPEC cut production in response, neutralizing these increases from outside its sphere of influence or not? And on that question, your guess is as good as mine. We think, in our forecast, excuse me, that OPEC is willing and capable of cutting production in response to these increases outside its control. If they do, this would mean that spare capacity, which emerges in response to production cuts, would go up to 6 million barrels per day within this decade. This is the highest level of spare capacity then since the 1980s. It will be a challenge to manage that for a cartel, to remain cohesive enough to do that. And sometimes you feel the first people now coming out of the woodwork comparing the situation to the 80s and saying, oil prices will go down. And for a variety of reasons, I don't share that view. But it will be a very delicate balance, and it will put pressure on OPEC. That's the first observation here. Now, you may say, this is kind of strange. There's the old guy talking about OPEC cuts, when in reality what we observe is what? We have seen a very high, very stable oil price for the last 3 years, and no voluntary cuts. Just the opposite. We see Saudi Arabia and others producing so much as they never had before. So what's going on? And this is my favorite story here. This is something most people are not aware. What has happened in the last 3 years is that we have actually seen, since the beginning of 2011, the period people call the Arab Spring, since the civil war in Libya, some of the biggest supply disruptions in the history of oil markets, and certainly the biggest since the collapse of the Soviet Union. With the civil war in Libya, and if you just add to this the war in Syria, the birth of a new country in Sudan and all the problems that brought with it, the sanctions against Iran, all of that took out cumulatively over the last 3 years, these troubles in North Africa and in the Middle East, about 3 million barrels per day. For comparison, the average supply disruptions in the 10 years before the Arab Spring was 100,000 barrels per day. So in terms of this tight market, a substantial amount. And by sheer coincidence, really by only sheer coincidence, this disruption was matched almost one by one, barrel by barrel, by the production increase in the US. It's one of the strangest things when you look at it. Even the time profile looks almost identical. That's why we had oil prices very stable and above 100 for a number of years. Well, that's why Saudi Arabia, which didn't have disruptions, can produce at record levels and record prices at the same time. It's absolutely fair to say that if we only had this kind of political and social upheaval in North Africa and the Middle East we have seen the last 3 years, you would have seen price spikes, you would have seen talk about the emergency strategic petroleum release, about the economy going to the docks, all the rest of it. It's also absolutely correct to say if we had continuation of a peaceful world and only this production increase in the US, we would have seen oil prices coming under pressure and need for OPEC to react. All of this. Right? It's sheer coincidence. And now back to our outlook. This poses then a real challenge if you're a forecaster. Because now the question is, we're not interested in short-term transitory things, right? During the economic crisis 2008, 2009, we didn't change our long-term growth forecast. What's a little recession among friends? It will wash out. So the question here is, did we enter a different world? Is this going to continue? Or do we need to forget it and just say it was just a transitory thing? We think that we did to some extent enter a different world, and that still will need to need for OPEC to cut. And we think so based on two reasons, one in the past and one in the future. The one in the past you see here. When you look at sizable supply disruptions in the past, here are some examples. The revolution in Libya and in Iran in the 1970s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq in the early 90s. In none of these cases was production back at pre-disruption levels 10 years later. In many cases, it never came back. When you have these disruptions, you have technical problems, like now in Iran. Nobody really knows how damaged these fields are, mixed up with political and economic upheavals and problems, and historically, they're never transitory. It always takes a long time. And the other reason for pessimism has to do with economics, basic economics and politics again. If you believe, and only then, that these kind of social and political upheavals we have seen in North Africa and the Middle East in recent years, at the bottom, for their reason for their being, have something to do with the economic situation of the people living in these countries, then you should not be too optimistic about the future of this region. Here is, not to step on anybody's toes, we did it for OPEC as a block, something on the economic situation of major oil-producing countries. Population growth, twice as high as the comparator group of other non-OECD economies, twice as high, massive pressure. Per capita income, believe it or not, for these countries, which should be about the richest on the planet, flat since 1975, where the others in the non-OECD increased 170%. And energy consumption, based on these massive subsidies, basically going through the roof. 75% per capita higher than in the rest of the non-OECD. What does this mean? It means, of course, these countries will continue to export oil and gas, but there is no way that they continue to grow their exports as fast as we have seen in the last 30 or 40 years. And that means less revenues, that means less money to pacify the population. And with the eyes of a simple economist, I should say, this looks like not too much reason for optimism, that the reasons for political and social turmoil are going away. As I said, if you believe that economics got anything to do with it. So based on two of these things, we do think that we will see sort of a more unstable world. Now that's one already example for concerns about energy security and for the huge amount of uncertainty we have here. And I want to finish that oil part also with coming back to this reorientation of oil trade, which we're seeing, which is another big adjustment process. Again, in the middle, you have now what's by now familiar. You have the shift of the major regions of the world, with North America turning a surplus region, which will be an oil, this time it's all oil, exporter. And then you have Asia and Europe being the only importing regions left, and you see yourself Europe fairly stagnant, actually needing less, but Asia needing a lot. In fact, we think that by 2035, 80% of all the interregional traded oil will go into Asia. Now you think about this, and this has been debated already some time now, what this means, that the Middle East, the major oil producing region, has to reorient all its exports away from the Western Hemisphere, from North America to Asia, to the Eastern Hemisphere. What this means for relations between Saudi Arabia and the US, between China and Saudi Arabia or Iran, and so you can construct your own sort of speculations and nightmares about it. In reality, it's getting even more difficult, because the increase in oil consumption in Asia, we think, will be such that the reorientation of trade from the Middle East into Asia is not enough to satisfy it. It will require additional resources from places like Africa or the former Soviet Union. So that's a massive adjustment. And of course, our baseline is that it will work out all right in the end, but it will require continued attention, keeping markets open, keeping trade open, not interrupting this process of globalization. Just a quick look at the two most extreme examples. The US had imports peaking in the year 2005, when the oil imports, when they accounted for about 65% of domestic consumption. We think this will go down to less than 10. We don't think they will become an exporter. China, believe it or not, an energy exporter 20 years ago, will over the same period likely see its import increasing to about 75% of its own consumption, meaning that both in volume terms and in percentage terms, China will be more import dependent, I should say, than the US has ever been. It's another huge adjustment coming under this bucket of energy security. In the interest of time, and because I want to come to the carbon issue, let me be brief with international gas markets. Essentially, gas, I told you, the fastest growing fuel, growing in all applications and in all regions. And then, of course, in gas, like in oil, we have the slightly older but equally massive questions of shale gas. Here, a similar exercise. Total production growth on the left-hand side between OECD and non-OECD. And again, the sliver in the middle, this is shale gas. Still heavily dominated by the OECD, i.e. by North America. Production profile on the right-hand side. In the matter of shale gas, we do think that coming also out of nowhere, it will account for about 21% of global gas production by 2035. That is massive. And it looks to some extent, when we look at the characteristics, similar to what we've seen for oil, but another extent it's different. Again, we are right now in a phase of very massively accelerating production growth, and again, at least in the US, that is set to decelerate. Again, the picture for the foreseeable future pretty much dominated of what happens in North America, and again, other countries moving in. The biggest this time is China. But different from the production forecast for tight oil, we do think that in this case for gas, the number of other countries adopting these technologies and moving in will be fast and high enough to reverse that picture of a gradual decline, which we see in the US and in North America, and to resume very, very rapid growth during that period. Another big area of uncertainty, but overall, shale gas seems to be really set to increase massively globally. However, just as a footnote, it's not the fastest growing component. It turns out that conventional gas in the non-OECD economy, in the so-called developing world, grows even more over that forecasting period. Natural gas is truly becoming sort of a developing country fuel gradually. Let me just point out the obvious consequence, and when we think about things like energy security, it's similar to what we've seen for oil and for primary energy, North America becoming a natural gas exporter. And what this means is, among other things, that the trade for natural gas with pipeline will decline and that the LNG trade will continue to increase. Now, LNG already accounts for about 10%, I think, today of global gas consumption. Right? We think that will go up to about 15%. Think of this for a minute. It's quite amazing. This is a very involved, complicated process, this, to freeze it down, put it in these tankers, and then regasify it. That would mean that about every 7th cup of tea, which is made by natural gas somewhere on the globe, has gone through this very complicated and involved process. And of course, it means that gas becomes a globally integrated market, similar to the market for oil. It's another thing which I want to leave for discussion. But it's important to realize that because gas historically was a pipeline fuel, and of course there are no pipelines connecting continents, you have really three different gas markets with very different characteristics in the Americas, in Europe, and in Asia. And gradually that is going to link up by LNG. And the big beneficiary of all of this will be the US. We think the US will become a natural gas exporter by 2016, LNG exporter by 2016, a natural gas exporter net by 2018, and that by the end of that forecasting period, the US will actually have moved from a gas importer to the second biggest LNG exporter in the world. And that will change market structures. Currently, the biggest LNG exporter is Qatar, controls more than 30% of the global market. By 2035, most likely the biggest one is Australia, but only with a market share of 20%. So there's increasing competition among these exporters, and the big question, of course, when you think about Russia, Ukraine, and all these discussions, is how much of that will go into Asia, how much of that will go into Europe. We do think that most of it will end up in Asia. Not only because of the high growth in places like China and other developing economies, but also because of the massive replacement needs in Japan, where they switched off nuclear power and want to substitute this with gas. Europe would have to pay a substantial premium to attract that, and Europe will, in our book, continue to be more reliant on pipeline imports from the former Soviet Union and North Africa. Pipelines which exist in Europe, into Europe, but not in Asia. And if there's need for this, I'm happy to come back in the discussion here. But what we're seeing both in oil and in gas is this massive shift in trade, a degree of instability in oil-producing countries, and also global integration in gas markets, which will lead to the oil indexation of gas prices coming under pressure, and to, let me show you this tool so that we have it complete, and to different regions developing very differently. Here's an example. In North America, the story is a fairly straightforward one. With the continued growth of shale gas, we'll be reaching a world when shale gas in North America will be bigger than conventional gas has ever been, continuing to crowd out coal, which currently then is shipped to Europe and all these things. For Europe, we predict extremely limited, almost no increase in shale gas, mostly because of high population density and political resistance. And then China is a bit of a special case because natural gas in China at the moment is very small, only 5% of the energy mix. We do think they will increase it very rapidly to about 12%. But in order to do this, they will need more shale gas, they will need more CBM, coal bed methane. Remember the canary dropping dead in the coal mine? This is stuff which you can buy in a drugstore here with a skull and crossbones, which they're using, and also more conventional gas. Because Europe needs higher, and I say Europe, not the EU, to include Norway. Despite Norway will have declining domestic production, increasing domestic consumption, and therefore needs more imports. And we think the way the infrastructure looks like, this is more likely to come through pipelines than through LNG. Now, let me just say one very quick word on renewables and other fossil fuels, and then end with CO2 emissions. When we look at the non-fossil fuels, and I come to renewables in a second, there is the same picture as we had before. Then the non-OECD just simply tries to get as much as it can. But one interesting question is how will nuclear energy perform? In our picture, it will not reach the same market levels, market shares which it had before, simply because we do not see reactor by reactor in places like Japan or Germany and others being replaced, which are shut off now over this forecasting period. And we do have a massive, massive wave of retirement as reactors, especially in the US and in Europe, approach the end of their lifetime after around 2030. We don't think this will be replaced one by one. In fact, the only substantial growth of nuclear energy, as far as we can see today, seems to be coming from three countries: China, India, and Russia. And they have all made statements to the effect that they will go ahead with their programs unabated, and I leave it to you to think about whether this will take place with more or less security checks, transparency, and all the rest of it. I'm on this count a little bit on the skeptical sides. And just one word on renewables before we come back to them. A development in our book still heavily dominated by the European Union, which has these enormously high penetration rates. I mentioned already 15% for power, which we think will go up to more than 30%. And even if volume growth in China is the largest, it is really the sort of developments in the European Union which drive our globally high growth rate. I say it again. Renewables will only come to about 7% of the total fuel mix by 2035, but that requires 6.5% growth per year, extraordinarily high for any fuel over long periods. And that is possible in turn only when you recognize the hidden assumption here that they will not bump against the same cost ceiling which killed the extension of market share for renewables. So, I don't know if I can convince you or not. I said we think there's enough fuels there to be not a constraint. There will be problems with energy security. We talked about supply disruptions. We talked about the reorientation of trade, but they will always be there. There's nothing magical about them. They can be taken about it. But I also mentioned the third bucket, namely this issue of sustainability and the fact that most people today, rightly or wrongly, tie this to CO2 emissions. Now, before I go on, I want to make also one thing clear. I'm not talking as an advocate here. Personally, I'm pretty agnostic. I cannot claim that I understand climate sciences. But I'm talking as someone, I mentioned that at the beginning, take me to speak to you as a forecaster, worried about forks on the road, areas of uncertainty. And perhaps the biggest area of uncertainty for any such forecast is this area. What happens if the world ever gets serious about CO2 emissions? I will show you in a second why I think it hasn't been serious so far. And I do a lot of this talking. When I go around the globe now, in particular outside of Berlin, Brussels, and the rest of Europe, climate change is not coming up very often anymore. It used to be only a few years ago, everywhere you went, the first three questions were all about climate change. Now nobody asks. It's funny because now the oil company comes and brings it back. But that's just how it is. I don't think that this is because people are not worried anymore. I think this is basically a result of people having been told two things which are entirely inappropriate and wrong. One, that this is a problem easily to control. Remember CCS, renewables, all this, we can do it. And two, from the Stern report onward, that it's a problem which is cheap. And it's not. It's a hell of a difficult problem, and it's certainly not being cheap to fix it. And I think these kind of attitudes have led people to some extent stepping away from the problem, but it doesn't mean that the problem goes away. So I'm speaking as someone who wants to delineate this kind of area of uncertainty and find out what happens if the issue comes back. So let's start with where we are. I mentioned that in this forecast, there's not much reason for comfort if you believe climate scientists. The good news is that we think that carbon emissions will grow less than energy consumption, 41% carbon emissions by about 29%. The bad news is that if they grow by 29% as we forecast, that this is way beyond all the thresholds which we most of the time are discussing. Two of them I want to mention. One is this threshold of 450 ppm parts per million, which for a long time climate scientists have taken to translate into a temperature increase of about 2 degrees Celsius, which is sort of the minimum, the maximum they thought which could be accommodated without major changes. Here you see what would be required in terms of energy consumption to get back to this 450 ppm level. It is not going to happen. We said this the first time 4 years ago, not because we like it, but because it is what the data indicated. Got a lot of flack for it. Now I think basically everyone agrees. Emissions will continue to grow, all of it in the developing world, driven by economic growth, will decline in the OECD. And the adjustments which would be necessary to limit us to this 450 scenario, basically physically not possible with a growing economy. Another one of these benchmarks often used is, you must have heard this too, is the level of 1990. We need to bring it back to 1990 level, stabilize it there. What we have in this forecast is a level twice as high as 1990, 3 times as high in the non-OECD. Right? That's what I meant by little reason for optimism. So what we decided to do then is to sort of step back with the intention of figuring out, so what could be the implications for a forecast like that. Step back, and what you do when you don't know an answer really, what I find always helpful is two things. You go back to basics and you go back to history. Back to basic means, what do we know about CO2 emissions? Of course, we know it depends on the economy, because economic growth means energy consumption growth, and that means more emissions. But we know actually a bit more about the mechanics. Basically, CO2 emissions are driven by two different systems, or outcomes, I should say. One is energy intensity, which we discussed before. The amount of energy per unit of GDP. The lower energy intensity, right, given your size of your economy, the less carbon emissions. That's just saying efficiency is good. The other one is carbon intensity. The energy which you burn, the lower the carbon emissions coming from it, the better. So if you burn coal, you have twice as much as if you burn gas, and if you have renewables, you have zero. Now, what do we know about those two variables? And actually, we know a lot. Energy intensity, I mentioned it earlier, is developing really very nicely. And this is a development which is complicated, goes always up with agriculture. As the share of the industry increases, energy intensity goes up. 300 people in a factory need more energy than 300 in a field. And then it goes down slowly as countries move away from industrial production more into services. 300 people in an office building usually use less energy than 300 people in a factory. But underneath that, we see a marked change since about the 1980s. Since about the late 1980s, we see a substantial acceleration of efficiency improvement by this measure, and we see countries converging. Very important. You can see that here. In fact, we are now having a situation where global energy intensity is the lowest for 140 years. So again, it's energy per unit of GDP. It doesn't tell you about levels. And it converges across countries at lower and lower levels. We also have a situation where the differences in energy intensity across countries are the very lowest since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and I mean the one in Europe. What drives this process? I think, for want of a better word, it's what we may call globalization. It's especially three things. One is the disappearance of the Iron Curtain. Since the 80s, and it's no accident that this happened since the 80s, basically every single fuel is tradable across any border. And this must have greatly contributed to fuels getting to their most efficient use. It also greatly contributed, of course, to the restructuring of the likes of Russia and China, and so where energy intensity was really, really bad. The second is standardization. It's the ugly side of standardization, that is, if you go home and you switch on television, your program is going to be like the program in Bombay or in Beijing or somewhere else in the world. And if you go out in a restaurant, never will your food be as similar as anywhere else in the world. The positive side is all the appliances, the TV sets, the cars, all the rest of it, are becoming standardized at the most efficient level in times of high prices. And thirdly, I think it is this very rapid diffusion of technical change, which we really have at an unprecedented rate. Today, a drilling rig in the South China Sea or in Alaska or in the North Sea, the differences are largely geology and weather determined. It's not so much technology. Somebody makes an invention, it goes out very fast. That has contributed to this massive improvement, and I said again, to this convergence of energy intensity. What do we know about carbon intensity? So now first we took the economy and the energy and looked how much energy we need. Now we take the energy we burn and look at the carbon emissions from burning it. First of all, there is some progress. The carbon load of energy of our fuel mix becomes somewhat lighter, but not much. The scale is different, noted on these two things. I told you already, 0.5% improvement in the last 20 years because of the high share of coal in the global economy. Really nothing to write home about. A little more in the future, 5 to 7% perhaps. Secondly, there is absolutely no convergence across countries. Maybe just the opposite. What does that mean? That means whatever drives the fuel mix seems to be disparately different in different countries. There's no convergence of a fuel mix which would somehow lower carbon. Bit of a puzzle, no? And that's where the second thing kicks in history. We have now accumulated a pretty big historical database, and it does help sometimes to go back to basics, and that's what we did. And we looked at the history of the fuel mix in the 20, roughly speaking, over the last 100 years, 20 biggest energy consuming countries. What came out of it is easily the most prettiest of all the slides, but I'll try to make it simple as well. It's not difficult, actually. You see time on the horizontal axis, And then on the vertical axis, this is a concentration measure. This is the most primitive one, share of the dominant fuel. So all the dots are countries. If you have a dot at 100%, it means basically there's only one fuel. It has 100% of the market. As the dots go down, diversity of the energy mix increases. And you can put other more sophisticated, for those economists among you, Herfindahl index looks even prettier. It just takes forever to explain. What this tells you, basically, every dot is a country at a point in time, that over the long term, the diversity of the fuel mix increases. More fuels are controlling what's happening in individual countries. Every dot a country, and then what we did, we color-coded it. Gray or black means coal, as before. Green means oil. Red means natural gas. And blue means all the non-fossil fuels. Right? And now you can tell a story. And that actually is a very simple story. Over time, the first observation is that the fuel mix becomes more diversified, less and less concentrated, more and more diversity. Makes sense, no? Economies become more complicated, technology advances, there's more fuels around which weren't around a few years ago, and so on. Secondly, there seems to be some regularity here. When countries industrialized early on, everybody industrializes based on coal. Dark is coal is the dominant fuel. It's not an invention of China today or so. Then, and that's the reason, of course, why I outlined this earlier, in the 1950s and 60s, all of a sudden, it turns green. And that's, of course, exactly that time when oil suddenly became available globally, and people switched to oil not only for transport, but also to replace coal and gas in industry and in power generation. Here's an example. Extreme cases, always the best to study. Japan, an extremely import-dependent economy, right? So look what happened. Everything they have to ship in, basically. So they rely on coal, of which they have some, and the rest shipped in, until the 1960s. And the share of coal already goes down. And then you see, boom, how they switch into oil as it becomes available. And as soon in the 1970s as oil becomes so expensive that it can't compete with coal and other fuels anymore, the share of oil in the economy declines. Right? But then what's interesting is that, again, since the 1980s or so, the systematic seems to stop. What we have nowadays is all sorts of fuels being used. Right? So you have here some countries like China, which have, I didn't show you that, but have a big decline in coal consumption because of their economies still remaining coal-based. Others, you see the red ones here, like Australia or like Russia, for example, becoming natural gas-based. Still others remaining reliant on oil. You have the US here, which we think in the future will become natural gas-based. Europe, the big exception, which will have a bigger share of non-fossil fuels combined than all the fossils. But there are other blue countries here. One of them is Sweden, and one of them is Brazil, with this huge share of hydropower. So the basic picture is that nowadays, fuel mix seems to be all over the place, dominated by all sorts of things. And the suspicion, of course, when you ask what drives this, is, well, it's not climate policy, and it's not a carbon price, so it must be economics. Right? It must be that countries just take whatever is cheapest and whatever is available. And there's an easy way to check this. Because I mentioned already that we are in a phase now where natural gas is shippable and coal can be shipped everywhere. And so what we have in the world, for better or worse, is very heavy competition actually between gas and coal in power generation. You can see that, study that in Europe now, the last 2 years. You know what happened? Gas becomes cheap and available in the US, crowds out coal, coal gets shipped to Europe, and in the UK and Germany and all these countries who have spent 20 years of money and brain power on climate change, they use more coal than gas, and CO2 emissions go up, and the biggest decline worldwide is in the US. This is just one example. So we have this global competition. And when you look at these markets where coal and gas competes, you have every potential influencing factor for the fuel mix in there somewhere. North America, a new technology emerges, and gas simply is cheaper than coal. It's not that they have a carbon price or something, and therefore more gas, less coal. Europe, the different picture, less coal, more gas, not because Europe has so much gas, it doesn't, it has lots of coal, but because Europe is rich enough and efficient enough to translate the preference of its population for cleaner fuels into this kind of picture. By the way, this is where we are right now. Gas falling, coal rising, but we think that regulation in Europe will catch up with this. China, a massive decrease in coal, not because yet of environmental reasons or because they're rich enough, but because the economy shifts and needs less coal. And then other big countries outside the OECD, India among them, Indonesia about them, the share of coal rises and is predicted to rise, the share of gas falls, not because they don't have gas. India and Indonesia sit on a lot of gas, but they decide to sell it abroad because it's cheaper to use domestic coal. Massive movements in each of these markets, but globally, over the forecasting period, is just a change of about 7%, because partially they offset each other. Now, why does it so? The first answer is, first approximation is, yes, it is economics which drives this fuel mix. Now, why does it matter? And we're already done, last one. You need only 2 more pieces of information to draw a conclusion, which I think is pretty striking. One is, as you know probably, when you produce 1 kilowatt hour of electricity with natural gas, not with coal, you have about 50% of the CO2 emissions, right? So you use gas, about half the emissions from using coal. The other is something we discussed already, the sheer dimensions of the system. Currently, about 1/3 of global energy is coal, a little less is natural gas, and renewables are somewhere 2.5%. Now you combine these systems, and to see how this works, just suppose we take our energy outlook and we freeze it. I take all the assumptions about the economy and so on, but I do not allow for any efficiency improvements. And I do not allow for any changes in the fuel mix. That would give us carbon emissions growth as indicated by this gray bar here, 30 billion tons. Now, luckily, we said, we predict continued improvements in energy intensity or energy efficiency. That will take off about 40% of that growth. And we allow for continued changes in the fuel mix, but as I said earlier, we expect them to be much, much smaller. And so that will only take off another about 7%. So the contribution to carbon emissions growth of energy intensity improvement is much larger than a fuel mix, no surprise so far. Of these 7%, about 4%, a little more than half, is the role of renewable crowding out other fuels. The rest, only less than 3%, is fossil fuel substitution. It's the larger share of natural gas combined with coal. And this really indicates to me 2 things. A, the world has not been serious about climate change, otherwise they would have made much more hay out of this possibility in fossil fuel substitution. Think of it again, 50% less emissions, 1/3 coal, almost 1/3 gas, compared to this tiny amount of renewables. And B, from the point of view of a forecaster only, if this issue becomes important again, if it comes on the global political agenda, this is where the low-hanging fruits are. This is where the intervention will have to take place to generate results. So we did the numbers. And when you do the numbers, and now I'm not talking forecasts anymore, for today, it turns out that if we were today to replace 1% of global power generation, coal with natural gas, right? We replace for 1% of global power, coal with natural gas. This would generate CO2 emission savings equivalent to increasing global renewables by 11%. Think about this, 1% switching global power between coal and gas. This is in the daily margin of error. It's imminently doable, in other words. Increasing global renewables by 11% is going to be very difficult, take some time, it's going to be horribly expensive. And that's what I meant when I said, when you look at these numbers from that, it's very simple, nothing wrong about it, no hidden assumptions or tricks. Then there is low-hanging fruits here, which obviously have never been tackled. Obviously, there was never a global carbon price or anything like that. And, of course, environmentalists don't like it because gas is bad, because it's fossil. Companies and countries don't like it because gas is more expensive than coal. So far, nothing much has happened, and it's explainable why. So let me wrap up, and I'm sorry I did a little longer. Coming back, easiest way to wrap it up, to these 3 basic themes. Do we have enough fuels? Is there a problem? I genuinely think, as I said, there's no resource constraint over the foreseeable future. Peak oil has died, its 150th death, rightly so. Everybody who thinks that we're running out of fuels is just barking up the wrong tree. Number 2, energy security. If we have it, will it get to their place where it's needed in an efficient and sustainable way, it's always going to be a problem. We think it's solvable, doesn't mean it has to be solved. These are the forks in the road for which you need outlooks like this to discuss them. And number 3, is this a sustainable system? If you listen to climate scientists, as we have described it, it's not. If, again, the eyes of a forecaster, if they are right and if this dawns enough people or so, there would be ways to interfere which we think would have to be to address fossil fuel substitution, whether one likes it or not, because that's where the gains are most immediate and most dramatic. I'll leave it here and
thank you very much.
To the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Christoph, for such a clear explanation of the outlook from the perspective of BP. I'd now like to call Paul Eakins up, who is the director of the UCL-Energy, the Institute for Sustainable Resources, to give a brief respondence.
And thank you, Christoph, for the most amazing tour de force of a kind of global perspective. One of the things I liked about it very much was the fact that it's a reality check, because practically all the graphs he showed started in the recent past and then went forward to the foreseeable future. Beyond 2035 is more or less guesswork, but up to then one can make educated guesses. But the recent past we kind of know about, and we need to know what it is. And in a lot of discussions about energy matters, we very often forget to look at the present and the recent past, with the result that our projections into the future don't start from reality, and that's obviously not a good place to be. Another reason why I liked it is that Christoph is a much braver man than I am and than we are at the UCL Energy Institute, where we run the UK Energy Research Centre's efforts on energy systems and energy systems modelling, because he does forecasts. We do scenarios. What's the difference between the two?
I didn't realize, I'm sorry.
No. I mean, it's a fundamental difference, because what Christoph is doing is putting his reputation on the line and saying, if on the basis of the kinds of trends which we think are going on, and that's the importance of the reality check, this is kind of where we're going to end up. And that's really important, because if you don't like where you're going to end up, and I don't, so I can put my cards straight on the table, then you better do something about it. Scenarios, in contrast, and we tend to do scenarios through to 2050, you can say, this is where we are, this is our best guess of the numbers, this is our best guess of the drivers, but then you can introduce all sorts of things like carbon constraints. You can say, well, what if the world gets serious about carbon, and so that by 2050 we have 80% lower carbon emissions. In this country, in the world, has 50% lower carbon emissions than it did in 1990, or than it does now, or it gets back to 1990. What does that look like? And our models do that. They give us lots of insights from doing that. But the big problem with doing that is that you can kind of believe that the models are self-fulfilling prophecies. And you can believe that the rather nice worlds that we can envisage, because we force the models to give us the rather nice worlds with these low carbon emissions, and I'm someone, unlike Christoph, I do believe the climate scientists, so I don't like what they're saying, and I do want to reduce carbon emissions, therefore. I can see these scenarios, and these scenarios tell me technically it can be done. Something perhaps where I'm slightly at variance with Christoph, and we might like to explore that, is that I don't believe it's over expensive. It's not free. I think the Stern Review probably underestimated the costs of decarbonisation, as he said. I think Lord Stern now reckons that he underestimated the cost. It's not 1%. But I think it's unlikely to be much more than 3% of GDP. And 3% of GDP, depending on what the costs of climate change are, might be a very good investment. It's still an enormous sum of money, and at the moment it's a sum of money which publics are not prepared to pay. One of the nicest things that I've heard recently is Lord Deben, John Gummer as was, who's now chairman of the Committee on Climate Change, talking about climate change's risk. And he started by asking his largely middle-class audience which of them had house insurance. And most of us put up our hands, we have house insurance. And he told us that on average in the UK that costs about £120 a year. The probability of your house burning down or having other major problems that will require you to call on that house insurance is about 0.02%, and yet we are prepared to pay £120 a year against that cost. He then made the point, which was quite telling for me, that that is the price that households in the UK are being asked to pay in order to meet the Committee on Climate Change's carbon budget. About £120 a year in 2020, rising slightly beyond 2020, and then falling. Well, you've probably been following as closely as I have the debate about the affordability of energy in this country. And at the moment, those of us who are prepared to pay the Committee on Climate Change's £120 a year by 2020 are being outnumbered by those who are not. Not because £120 a year is an outrageously expensive sum of money, but we're not yet convinced that we need to pay it for those purposes. A fascinating part of your presentation, which I wasn't fully aware of, and which I've now got firmly caught in my memory, is that slide of the changes in trade relations that are going to happen over the next few years, given these drivers. Such that the EU and Asia will be competing for export, for energy export. And Asia will be wanting far more energy than the EU. And I can imagine that that becomes a deeply uncomfortable place for the EU to be. Partly because many of the exports that it's competing for will go to Asia more easily than they can come to the EU, and partly because, if it's gas, the prices might be higher in Asia than they are in the EU, as they are at the moment, and as we know, exports will tend to follow prices. So I think that energy security issue around European energy is terribly important, and we probably shouldn't have needed President Putin of Russia and his ambitions in Ukraine to remind us of that. Coming back to these drivers of these forecasts, just to make us feel as uncomfortable as I think we should feel, how certain can we be of these drivers? And I think we can be pretty certain of the three big ones. The three big ones are population growth. There will be 1 billion more people in 2035 than there are now, short of a most calamitous demographic collapse. All those people want economic growth, and if they don't get economic growth, and if we don't get economic growth, then we will have extreme difficulty managing our societies. And we know that from the recent past with the collapse, the financial collapse from 2008, unemployment, Greece, Spain, 50% youth unemployment, all that stuff. And the third one is the desire for these burgeoning developing country populations for modern energy services. One thing you didn't bring into your pictures at all is the dominant use of renewables in the world today, which is people burning dung and wood in their homes to cook and getting huge health problems as a result. None of us would put up with that for 10 minutes. And yet, these billions of people are going to want the energy services that we've got. Which leads me to the end, because you said many times you wanted discussion, and I would much rather listen to you talk than myself, and I'm sure the audience is right there. And stuff that we can agree on. We can agree on that the world is not currently taking climate change seriously. Some of you will have come to the seminar which we organised recently with one of the researchers from Carbon Tracker, who've done all this work on stranded assets, calculating that a very large proportion of current hydrocarbon reserves needs to remain unburnt in the absence of CCS, and actually CCS doesn't make much difference either, if we are to meet the 2 degrees target. The fact that stock markets have not discounted these assets 1%, as far as we can judge, means that the stock markets don't believe policymakers take climate change seriously. Those of us who do take climate change seriously, therefore, have a difficult task on our hands. And the last thing I think I want to say is really to amplify just a little what you said about what needs to happen. The only way we can change that trajectory, there was a slide there, the other slide I shall remember was your slide with carbon emissions going up, OECD broadly flat, developing countries increasing lots, and then showing what the carbon emissions would have to do to get to the 450 ppm trajectory. I would like you to imagine that slide. If I had it here, I would put it up there so we could imagine it together more easily. I'd like to imagine you that slide, instead of the carbon emissions cuts coming from the developing countries, the carbon emissions cuts were coming from OECD countries. Because realistically, that's where they will have to come from. And we know that, that's why we have a climate change target of 80% in the UK, 80% reduction by 2050.
Good luck.
There it is. So that little red dotted line has got to do this. It's got to start here, and it's got to come down there, so that the overall emissions don't go up as much, but the developing countries continue to have carbon emissions growth. And that is something they are going to insist on, and there is no power in the world that can stop them, and there is no moral argument which we can make which will have any robustness. So there are only 3 ways in which we can change that trajectory. You mentioned one, and that's gas for coal. Gas for coal. Wherever people are burning or look as if they will be burning coal, somehow the world has to try to ensure that they burn gas, and that will be mainly in emerging economies, as Christoph's graph showed. That's where the big coal consumption is coming up. The economics of that are formidable, because gas is already more expensive than coal. If everyone wants to shift out of coal into gas, you don't have to be a whiz-o economist to know that that's going to put upward pressure on the gas price, downward pressure on the coal price, so that the incentives to use coal instead of gas will be much enhanced. But unless we can get that gas for coal shift, and there are lots of benefits of gas for coal, look at the inner city air of Beijing, for example, lots of benefits of switching away from coal towards gas, then we don't stand a chance of keeping climate change within reasonable bounds. The second major thing, which you didn't talk much about, coming back really to Europe now, is that we need renewables and or nuclear, either a mix or an enormous amount of one, to substitute for gas in countries like the UK. All our scenarios suggest that we can't heat our homes with gas by 2050. We have to do it through decarbonised electricity from either renewables or nuclear. That's a huge change. And similarly, we need renewables and or nuclear electricity for liquids in transport. But the whole debate about electric vehicles and all that. That's not something that's going to take off immediately in developing countries. That's something which Europe, United States to some extent, and Japan will need to pioneer. And you can see early signs of that pioneering happening. But there are real limits to the extent, the speed with which these new technologies can grow. Some of you with even longer memories may remember that we had Martin Haig here from the Shell Scenarios team, published with some colleagues, academic colleagues, a really robust piece of work suggesting that it takes a minimum of 30 years to deploy a major new energy technology. We somehow have to break that 30 years. We have to show that we can get this renewables to come down that cost curve, and I take your point there about the glass ceiling, come down the cost curve, see if one can make nuclear both cheaper and safer, so that that becomes a more realistic option for expansion. And I don't know really any realistic scenarios for its expansion. It's finding it difficult even to maintain its share of electricity at the moment, in order to ensure that we get that dip, steep dip in OECD country emissions, in order to make sure that the developing countries have space for carbon emissions there. This is a huge ask. It's a global ask and has to come about through global policy of a kind we've never seen before. It's a huge European ask in order to fundamentally reshape the European energy system, and it's a huge national ask in order to persuade the people of this country to be able to be prepared to pay an extra 120 quid a year on their dual fuel bill in order to finance this transition. For me, that is eminently affordable, given what the climate impact science is telling us, coming out of Working Group 2, which has been published in the last couple of days. Whether we shall rise to that challenge remains to be seen, and I'd now like to turn you back to questions to Christoph. Thanks very much.